So welcome everybody. On behalf of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy, I'm really happy to be here today and have a chance to introduce and to learn from Thorsten Schulten, who, among other things, is going to be an author of a chapter of a forthcoming book that Sharon Locke and I are editing on sectoral bargaining. So this is a chance to meet a future co-author. Thorsten is wears many hats. He's currently a visiting professor at the ILR school at Cornell, where he's been for about 3 months. But he's also a researcher at the Institute of Economic and Social Research of the Hans Berkler Foundation, where he's been for more than 25 years, and where he studies unions, industrial relations, and economic democracy and its impact on the overall political economy. He's also the scientific head of the WSI Collective Agreement Archive, the leading institution in Germany to monitor and evaluate collective bargaining of obvious relevance for the talk today. His research there focuses on unions' wage and working time policies, minimum and living wages, and the development of collective bargaining systems. And he's a professor at the Institute for Political Science at the University of Tübingen, also in Germany, where he teaches courses on political economy and labor relations for both grad students and undergrad students. Today he's going to talk about the EU Minimum Wage Directive and the implications of that. I should say, among other things, that Thorsten is an expert in sectoral bargaining, and which will be relevant to the talk today, but I also invite discussion about that because of its incredible relevance to the development of labor relations and union law in the United States today. So with great pleasure, Thorsten, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks a lot for the invitation here. Actually, I'm a little bit sad because it's already my last week here in the States. So I had the pleasure to stay around 3 months at Cornell University and also did some traveling to some cities in the States. And I must say I had a very good time. I learned a lot. I discussed with so many friends and colleagues. And of course, it's a great honor also now to have the opportunity to discuss with you and share your views on the topic. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Of course, also thank you very much for raising the expectations in my talk. I mean, that's what you have to do, and so hopefully I can fulfill that. Yeah, so the title of my talk today is The Road to 80% collective bargaining coverage, and I think probably from a US point of view, where you have a coverage of 11% or so at the moment, this might be a provocation or a utopian or whatsoever, or what is this crazy guy talking about? And of course, my talk will be I try to show you my agenda for the talk, but it's I have no here. Sorry, we'll pull that. No. Yeah, so actually these benchmark or target or whatever you might call it of 80% bargaining coverage comes from the so-called European Minimum Wage Directive, and that's the first point I will talk to you about. I will give you a little bit about the background and the insight of what is coverage, what this European Minimum Wage Directive means. Secondly, I will tell you a little bit about bargaining coverage in Europe, and you will see there is really a great variety of countries. We're talking about countries between 12 and 100% bargaining coverage, and I also will give you some arguments, some insight why it is so different and what explain, in particular, of course, the countries with this relatively high bargaining coverage. Thirdly, I will try to systemize the instruments a little bit and talk about what are really good instruments, ways to increase the bargaining coverage, give you a little bit of an insight about the ongoing implementation process of the European Directive. And finally, you'll hopefully allow me also to have some thoughts on the US. So what I might think, how it will go on further with the US collective bargaining. Well, that's the program. So I already start. And before I talk about the European Directive, I want to make you aware that Europe has not always been very labor friendly, to say very politely. You might also say they have, in a certain way, been very anti-labor in their policy. And some of you may remind also of the time of the big financial crisis in the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010. The Euro crisis, where we had a crisis policy promoted by the European Commission, by the European Central Bank, but also with support of the International Monetary Fund, so the so-called Troika of these two institutions, which came up with so-called reform plans. Reform plans, especially for those countries who had a high debt and they wanted to get money from these international institutions, they had to fulfill these reform plans. That's typical also way how the International Monetary Fund was always working, and we had the same now. Europe, especially with countries from Eastern and Southern Europe, and all these so-called reform plans include relatively concrete demands regarding labor policy and labor market regulations. And what I would summarize, I can't go so much into the detail of also these programs, but they also, all of them also had a clear, I would say, radicalized version of neoliberal view on both minimum wages and collective bargaining. They saw it, these institutions mainly as neoliberals usually do, as a constraint to the adaptability of capital, as a threat to competitiveness. And therefore, their recommendation were, in terms of minimum wages, to freeze or even cut the minimum wages. And in terms of collective bargaining, they usually demand for radical decentralization of collective bargaining. This was the official policy. And there is one document, this is a labor market development document, which I think from 2012, which you can still find at the web, where probably this policy has been expressed most clearly. And I just give you one quote from that document. At the end of the document, there's a list of what the EU Commission calls employment-friendly reforms. Employment-friendly reforms. And we find a list of all kinds of measures of regulating labor markets, cutting social spending, and so on. And one point, and it's a literal quote, is overall reduction of wage-setting power of trade unions. So it's in that document. And of course, that document has been criticized a lot then, and the unions came, well, you always talk about in your Sunday speeches about social Europe and how important the social partnership is, but here, when it comes to policy, you write about reduction of union power. Well, and the defense was relatively poor. They tried to get up saying, well, this was just a description, analysis of the reality, not a normative statement, but nevertheless, policy was a good, especially with the couple states. Okay, against that background now, the European Minimum Wage Directive is, you might say, it's really a paradigm shift in the whole discourse about collective bargaining and unions. Because its basic social, economic, and even political goals are now suddenly minimum wages and collective bargaining are basically seen as positive, as a good thing to provide better living conditions, to reduce inequality, as important institutions to promote a more inclusive economic development strategy, and even politically as an instrument, of course, to strengthen economic democracy and therefore also to stabilizing probably the crisis of our political system, and including the crisis of the European integration itself. Because, and that's probably the link between the two, after the EU did all these crisis policy at the beginning of the 2010s, of course, we saw a huge wave of delegitimizing EU policy. So there was really a crisis of legitimation. There is the most obvious expression was, of course, the increase of far-right politicians and parties all over Europe, which are always also very nationalistic, very anti-European, anti-this EU project. And probably in the UK, the Brexit was, of course, probably the climate of that development. And during that crisis period, even conservative, not Labour-friendly politicians came to a point saying we have to do something about that. We have to strengthen our legitimation, and we have to show also ordinary people that European integration is something which is good for their living and working conditions and not bad. And under that context, suddenly the issue of social Europe, with all kinds of different initiatives becoming more and more prominent since the mid-2010, and probably the most important expression of this is this European Minimum Wage Directive. So that's just the background on the directive. So, and if you are interested, I have a couple of advertisement blocks in my talk. I hope this is okay. So this is the first one. If you are interested more to know more in detail about the background of all this shift and this development, I would recommend you that article. So, just to make you aware that this shift in the thinking about minimum wages and collective bargaining is not only in the European scene, but we can see it also in various different organizations and countries. I think a very important issue here is what I might call the new view on collective bargaining by the OECD. The OECD also was traditionally a very hardcore neoliberal think tank. You have these famous OECD employment guidelines from the 1990s, where one core issue was always decentralization, decollectivization of collective bargaining, weakening of union power. So they all had these agendas. And since the mid-2010s, they also started to change their view on collective bargaining, and probably the most clearest expression of this change is this report. I think it's from 2019 about collective bargaining and changing work, where they basically say collective bargaining, especially comprehensive collective bargaining in front of sectoral or even cross-sectoral bargaining, is a major institution to guarantee, to reduce inequality, to guarantee a more inclusive way of economic growth. So and even to master economic crisis, master economic transition. So all the recent crises we saw with Corona, and then with the international crisis coming up, with the war in Ukraine and so forth, all these experiences, I think, ended up in a way that politicians say, well, we need institutions, we need attempts to stabilize our society. Otherwise, we really run into big danger. And I think against that background, you can see this trend that suddenly, or not even suddenly, but that you see that especially collective bargaining has been just much more positive, and there is a readiness really to say, well, we have to do something about improving our collective bargaining system. And before I talk about Europe more in detail, I want to just make you aware that even also outside the European Union, you have a couple of countries where you see more recently attempts to strengthen collective bargaining. You see it in the UK, you see it especially in New Zealand, Australia, you have debates in Canada, You have interesting developments in some Latin American countries. For instance, Chile set up a big commission with international economic support to really rebuild its overall collective bargaining system. If you want to know more about it, I recommend the special issue of the International Labour Review last year, where you have a lot of examples from this international level. And even in the US, I had to learn when I was here, there is a big debate about sectoral bargaining, but I come back to that in my last point. But now I want to talk about what is this European directive about. It mainly has two aims. The first aim is promotion of adequate minimum wages levels. Secondly, promotion of collective bargaining. So, and I will talk mainly about the second point, but just very briefly about the minimum wage aspect. There is there has been one major constraint about this directive. And this is the question, the fundamental question: has the European Union even the competence to set up such a directive? And this issue is very much contested. And there will be, on 11th of November this year, there will be a final decision at the European Court of Justice. And we're really looking forward what the court will say, because it has been taken to the Court of Justice by the governments of Denmark and Sweden, with the argument that they say they had no competence. And of course we won't see. So I was, to be honest, I just told you, I was scared when setting up that meeting, because at that time it was not clear when the judge would make his judgment, and I was afraid that I was talking about a point which had already not existed anymore. But so I'm luckily, and we will see. So, having that in mind, you might understand the special character of this directive. So this is not a classical directive in the sense that it set up certain standards which has to be fulfilled by all the EU member states. But this directive mainly defines procedural rules, so how to set up adequate minimum wages, how to have a procedure of strengthening collective bargaining, but not so much really concrete targets or aims in substance. What they do regarding the substance is that they give more a kind of, I would say, call them strong recommendations. And regarding minimum wages, of course, the strong recommendation is to use so-called indicative reference values, which means that the recommendation here is that the level of the national minimum wages should be at least 60% of the national median wage or 50% of the average wage. As I said, this is not a binding norm, but it is a strong recommendation, and interestingly, it has become highly effective. So many countries now using these reference criteria to develop or to think about their own national minimum wage policy. And indeed, here you just very shortly, you have the figures. These are the figures from 2024 about minimum wage and the percentage of median or average wage. And you see that there are only 2 countries at the moment, which are Slovenia and France, who fulfill that criteria. All the others are very much below. So the implementation of that criteria would mean, for the European context, a significant increase of the minimum wage. You see also the national minimum wage of the US, which has been not adopted for 50 years. No, it wasn't 50, but 15 years also. So, as I said, it will have an enormous impact. And we see that not all, but many countries, including, for instance, Germany, where I come from, are using these criteria for their national wages. So in that sense, it's already a success. But the main point I want to talk about more in detail is, of course, collective bargaining. And here it says, first of all, it defines the aim. We want to strengthen collective bargaining. And we want to strengthen it, and then they give very general arguments in the way of especially strengthening the capacity of so-called social partners, unions and employers association, to engage, and then they literally say, in particular in collective bargaining, in particular at sectoral and cross-sectoral. So there's a clear perspective. We want to increase collective bargaining in general, but our main focus is in particular sector and cross-sectoral level. And I think the most important point in that directive is the following, and this is the procedural rule. The directive asks all member states in the EU, all 27, where the current bargaining coverage is below 80%, so less than 80%, here the 80% criteria comes from, that they should set up a kind of action plan. The states should do it in cooperation with unions and employers, but if they're not cooperating, which also sometimes is the time, but especially employers do not want to have that, then also without them to set up a concrete action plan with concrete measures and a concrete time schedule and a process of reviewing and monitoring the whole process. Again, the directive is not saying about what the countries should do in substance. Let's leave to the autonomy of the national state, but they set up this procedure. So what that would mean in practice, I come to my second point. What is the current bargaining coverage? And here, first of all, you see the trend. This is the bargaining coverage, the average in the European Union. And you see in the back to the early 1990s, we had the 80%. So the 80% criteria was fulfilled on average, not in every country, but in those countries. And what you see since then, that we have almost, on average, a quite continuous decline, and today we are talking about around 2/3 of the workers in the European Union, on average, are still covered by collective agreement. So this is the trend. But the reality, of course, is extremely diverse, as you can see here. So you have a high diversity between Poland, which only have 12%, so pretty close to the US, Greece, up to countries, you can't see that. So Belgium and Italy, they claim to have already 100%, but you have a couple of other countries which 90 or at least more than 80%. I mean, you can also, I won't do that in the moment, just to make you aware, of course, these are figures from the OECD. The OECD called these figures estimations. So they are not harmonized statistics, but there are different national statistics. And for one or another country, you also might question the figures, just to make you aware about that. For instance, if Italy 100%, you might question. If you are interested, we come back in the Q&A session of that. But nevertheless, I mean, in general, you just see the differences and the trends. And if we now look to these 80% criteria of the European Commission and about this directive, you can see most states, so 17 out of 20 EU states, are below that benchmark. So they have, until the end of this year, set up these action plans. 10 are fine so far, as the figures say, but 80%, 17, so a majority of the EU countries have to do something, they have to set up such an action plan. The interesting question, of course, is what explains these differences in these bargaining coverage among the European countries. And here just a very few thoughts about that. First of all, you might think also as pro-labor friendly or as trade unionist. I'm also a trade union member as a researcher. Said, of course, it's about union strengths. So the next slide, you can see the relation between union density on the one hand and bargaining coverage on the other hand, and probably at the first glance it's a quite confusing picture, I can assume. So if you look more closely, you can see three clusters. You have these two clusters here. On the one hand, you have a cluster where with relatively low bargaining coverage and low union density. These are in particular Eastern European countries. Also, Greece is in that cluster. Islands to cover that. So there it seemed to be going quite fine, low union density, low bargaining coverage. Then you have a very few countries. These are especially northern European countries plus Belgium, where you have a high coverage and a high union densities. But I would say these countries are really an exception because these are all countries coming from the so-called Ghent system. Ghent system means Ghent is a city in Belgium, and it was a city where historically this system has been developed for the first time, and which basically means unions are running unemployment insurance funds. And therefore it's to get good conditions for unemployment insurance, there is a very strong incentive for workers becoming union. But this is a very exceptional thing. So the more typical thing is the third cluster. The more typical thing is the third cluster. The third cluster, you have a group of countries where you have on the one hand a relatively high bargaining coverage, so pretty much the majority of workers are covered by the union. But the union density is still, well, also not that high, usually something between 10 and 20%, 25%. So this is, so in these countries, there seem to be other instruments or institutions which guarantee that you have a high bargaining coverage. And the first is, of course, and here again you have these 27 EU countries, is the bargaining level, and probably you're all very much familiar with that. All the countries with a high bargaining coverage, where you have a majority of workers covered, have a sectoral bargaining system. So there is no, I'm not aware of any single, even also not only in Europe, but also in the world, I'm not aware of any single bargaining system which have company bargaining, where you have a majority of workers covered. So I would say you can't have the coverage of a majority of workers without sectoral bargaining. So the company bargaining system, you will never look at that. And that's very clear here. So you see all the countries, the blue ones, sectoral bargaining, or even sometimes cross-sectoral national form of this, but that's also an exception. While all the countries with a very low bargaining coverage, they have basically not a bargaining system like this. This is one element, but there is also another element, and that is the support for sectoral bargaining by the state or by the society more in general. And here you might distinguish between two major elements. One is, I already mentioned, the so-called Ghent system, which directly supports trade union density, trade union organization. And the others is more a frequent use of extension or similar equivalent systems to make sure if you have an agreement concluded at a sectoral level, this agreement is valid for all companies in a service. This is a classical form of extension, and there are, of course, different methods how to do it. I can recommend the book forthcoming, there will be a chapter about explaining how these extension mechanisms work. But you should read the book, so therefore I won't go into detail with it. So, but to summarize the thing, to get a high bargaining coverage from a European experience, you need, first of all, sectoral bargaining, and secondly, you need a form of state support for that sectoral bargaining system, whatever that is. So usually extension, also other instrument. And finally, this does, of course, not mean that union density is not relevant. Again, so I don't want to be misunderstood here, of course, because first of all, having a high bargaining coverage does not mean that you have good collective agreements. You might have collective agreements, but the quality of the agreements, of course, still depend on the union power. And also, of course, the certain rely on state support makes it necessary that you have strong trade unions, not only at the workplace level, but also at the political level. We saw that in the crisis I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, at the end of the 2000s, where many countries were affected, where suddenly they lose their state support for bargaining systems, or even the state was trying to push for a more decentralized bargaining system, and without strong union power, of course, they were not able to defend their system. So it is not an argument against trade union power, but it's more an argument to see all the things together. Yeah, so this is another commercial advertising thing. If you want to be interested in more in detail about national bargaining system, there is a great 4-volume book by the ETUI, European Trade Union Institute, on all the national bargaining systems in Europe, including a wonderful chapter on Germany, which was written by myself. And you have a similar book also on the trade union structure, which is even more recent. And the good thing is you can it's for free download. So if you go to the ETUI page, you can download those books, also individual chapters. So since the ETUI is funded also by the European Commission, interestingly, they had to make a free access policy, but it's of course good for us to have easy access to that. That was the advertisement. I already come more closely to the end of my talk. First, very briefly about the implementation of this EU Minimum Wage Directive. So first of all, the good thing of this directive is collective bargaining is almost everywhere in Europe at the political agenda. So almost everywhere in Europe, politicians, trade unions, employers are discussing about what's going on with the bargaining system and how to increase it. So that's, first of all, a very good thing. And then we see, and that's the obligation, until the end of this year, all the 17 countries where the bargaining coverage is at the moment below 80% have to set up these action plans. And there are, of course, big debates going on what could be part of these action plans. And then the unions came up with demands, wish lists, whatsoever. The DGB, the German trade union, have published a 20-point bullet list of what they all want to have in order to strengthen the collective bargaining in Germany and so on. But what the real outcome of that will be, of course, highly depends then on the national level and on the struggle of these national levels. So that's all what I was talking about is, of course, highly contested. There are both academics, but especially, of course, the business community, or a large part of the business community, I might say, which are strong, which have been, right from the beginning, strongly against this directive anyway, and they're still, of course, strongly against or want to read all these processes. Just to, I can't go through all these details. If you have more detailed question about that, we can discuss them later on, but just to systemize, I mean, there's a huge varieties of approaches and instruments which are discussed now in the context of setting up these national action plans. And if you would distinguish them roughly, it's on the one hand about capacity building for unions, but also for employers association. In many countries, especially in Eastern Europe, it's a problem you have no sectoral employer to bargaining with. So what do you do then? Probably that's also a case which you might have a problem in the US, how to set up these things. And then the ideas are, of course, that you have, well, like you are going also to have some state-supported sectoral bargaining panels, committees, whatever you call them, to make sure that also employers are on the bargaining table. But these are, on the one hand, on the other hand, you have forms of political support, so strengthen the possibility to extend collective agreements. One big issue, for instance, in Germany at the moment is a draft law on public procurement and collective bargaining, so to make sure that only those companies get a public contract which are relying to collective agreement standards. So all these kind of debates. So this is the broad picture, which in one form or another are debated among the different European, or within the different European countries. Last point, some thoughts about the US. First, about my learning experience. My learning experience was that, you are probably very familiar about that graph. Yes, the development in the US, union density. And what I know, what I was not never really thinking about that, but it becomes so clear to me, even in the high days of the US system, it was always a system, only a system for a minority of workers. So the US system was never able really to cover the majority of workers. That's probably the major difference to many, especially Western European countries, that the idea of being strengthened, and of course I know that the influence probably the impact of unions goes beyond the areas which they organize, but nevertheless, it was only a minority, and now, I mean, it's really a tiny minority which is still affected. And I'm pretty much, I think it's very clear from the European perspective to think about what often also you find in union arguments. Okay, we just have to be strong and then we are able to cover more workers and so on, is important, is fine. I would support any union organizing campaign, of course. But nevertheless, you can't get majority of workers covered only through organizing. I think this is a big myth where unions believe in, sometimes there are also some researchers might believe in, but I think it's never been the case. So you need, in order to have a system which really covers the majority of workers, you really need to have these additional institutions which are able to extend the success which have unions in some areas where they're strong to majority of workers, and that's in particular sectoral bargaining, of course. And I was very interested, very surprised to see how many articles you have and the debates about sectoral bargaining. I think in the meantime I have more than 50 articles on my computer about discussing sectoral bargaining in the US. So most of them positive. There are also, of course, some critical things. I was also interested to see that it was around the political spectrum, though there were even conservative approaches for sectoral bargaining, which were of course very tricky because then they forget about the right to strike and so these kinds of things. So, but nevertheless, there was a big debate, and I must say, and this is now an advertisement, but not for me, but for you, that I really like the Clean Slate document, which I think is a very, very useful, very inspiring approach. I would say I would not agree to every detail of what you were writing. Some points sounds a little bit surprising from a European point of view. For example, the point when you want to give the state a kind of control function about the content of it, whether or not it fulfills some criteria and so on. From a German point of view, there's an autonomy of social partners, so they won't agree with that point. But these are just concrete points, of course, to debate. But in general, I think this is a very good and very forward-thinking approach. Of course, we all know that it's probably not yet the time to introduce it, but nevertheless, I mean, that's the importance of science, of academics, to have these kind of, not utopian, but really concrete, realistic visions how to improve and to do things. And my last slide is that one. I also looked a little bit to the history of the US system, which I found very interesting. And I found this very interesting article from the New York Times from Robert Wagner, which by the way was also German, came over with this as a small child with a German family, came here and then became the state senator from New York City. And he, I think, in the year before the Wagner Act was adopted, he wrote an article in the New York Times discussing these things about collective bargaining. And he was, at that time, in particular, very strongly arguing against the concept of the so-called company union at that time, as far as I understood, were unions which were very close to the employer, sometimes even set up by the employers, so they were what you might call yellow, not real unions, and they made all kinds of deals with them. But of course, dominated by management, and they said this whole concept is totally against the idea and the philosophy of the New Deal. And when it comes to the wage question, it is very obvious that the wage question has to be dealt not only at the company level, but also on the industry, state, or he said even within the nation wide. And he strongly demands the unions to say you have to organize on this broader level to make sure that you can guarantee a fair share for your constituents, for your members. Unfortunately, we know how the history was developed, but I think to argue, my impression was to argue for sectoral bargaining in the US at the moment, it would really make sense also to look to the history in order to get to think what they really wanted to achieve that time, maybe also why they were not able to achieve that, why they failed that time. But I think regarding the New Deal philosophy, it's very clear that sectoral bargaining fit pretty much very good to these concepts. Well, that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for questions, and if you don't mind, I'll ask the first one.
Sure.
So, to a U.S. observer anyway, one thing that's surprising about the minimum wage directive is that Sweden and Denmark don't like it.
Yeah.
And in fact, Denmark is leading the charge in court against the minimum wage directive. And so my understanding is that the opposition is grounded in the idea that these questions should be resolved through collective agreements between the unions and employers and not by the state.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you could comment on your understanding of Swedish and Danish opposition to the minimum wage directive.
Yeah.
Why you think it's misplaced,
Yeah.
and what we might learn from that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. I've been a couple of times, especially in Denmark, debating that. I think I reached a point where I wasn't sure they would still let me into the country because I was very critical on that. Yeah, I mean, the argument is, of course, what you're saying. Sweden and Denmark are among these very few, very exceptional industrial relations and bargaining systems with this high union density ground on the GAN system, of course, and the tradition where indeed many things which in all other countries are regulated by the state, social policy things, minimum standards for work and so on, are exclusively regulated by collective bargaining. And they also have no, and that's very, I think, most important, these countries have no statutory minimum wage. And the unions are also very much against it because they said, we strong unions, it's our duty as unions to guarantee decent minimum wages through collective bargaining, and we can make it through our system. We cover almost everyone, and we do not want to have the state involved in here. And if the state is involved, we are scared that this will weaken our system. So this is the way of thinking. By the way, Germany also introduced the minimum wage only in 2015. Before that, we had a 10 years debate. And some of the unions in Germany argue very much like the Danish and Swedish unions argue today. So there was always this idea, we are strong, we can do it. Well, I mean, what you might say against that is, so first of all, the directive so far is very clearly, they also say it by themselves, no, it has no impact on these countries. So the countries are fine. They don't have to introduce a minimum statutory minimum wage. That was very clear in the directive right from the beginning, saying, I mean, if you have a system with strong collective bargaining and you're able almost for everyone to guarantee decent minimum wages, then go for it. There is no reason to change it. That was very clear from the beginning. And also, secondly, I think it does not really affect also their bargaining system. So nobody is asking for a change in this country. So probably I would think that the threats seen by these colleagues were a little bit overdone. And in the end, it was also, I mean, there was also a very strong debate, if not to say really struggle within the European Trade Union Organization, because also, as you rightly say, also the unions were defending this position, saying we do not want to have that directive. And then it becomes, of course, also a little bit a question of solidarity. because rightly, of course, the European Trade Union organizations say, yeah, but if this is a directive which has no effect for you, but has a major effect, or at least a potential positive effect for the most of the EU countries, you can't be against it. Because in the end, the Danish always said, oh, you can become like us, develop our system, and then you will be fine. But of course, if you would go more into detail about why they have this system, this is very exceptional. You probably can't easily invade against system or whatsoever in other countries. I don't think that this would be such a major problem, which is not. But that really we had to struggle with this paradoxical situation that social democratic-led governments with support of strong unions were against this directive.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much.
And then just raise your hands if you want to ask questions.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I'm a French professor of political science. Here. Thank you for your question as well, because I had about the same question. But I would like to react to two figures that you gave in your presentation. So,
Sure.
I'm interested in and puzzled by Poland, which has like the lowest level of collective bargaining coverage, that as we can see in the document that was circulated. But you also said that in slide 2 or 3, I think, we could see that it has a high level of minimum wage, like 59. It's not so far from France. And I was puzzled by those two figures because you seem to say that the high collective coverage, bargaining coverage of it is a factor of higher wage, but Poland is not so disgraced. And so my question was also, maybe there is this, maybe there are other institutions as you what's the situation in Poland?
I mean, the Polish case is exactly that you have a relatively high statutory minimum wage, so it's set by the state, and it was a very big issue. I mean, in Poland you had for a very long time quite right-wing populists, but also drawing very much on social issue questions. So they were these kind of right-wing, I mean, you have different types of right-wing populists. You have the more neoliberal ones, and you have the ones who are also trying to use their support also to a kind of social policy development. And instead, and the unions were quite critical in that context, because they said, instead of improving the bargaining system, the state said, well, we care for you, we don't need the unions, we increase the minimum wages even without the unions doing it, and therefore came up with a relatively high figure. I mean, this figure, 95%, always means the relation between minimum wage to median wage. It says nothing, of course, about the overall wage levels, because, I mean, it could also be the case, and a little bit it is also the case in Poland, that you have a relatively low median wage anyway, and therefore, I mean, the minimum wage in relation to the median wage might be quite high, but this does not mean that this is an extraordinarily high wage. Right. Even from a living wage perspective, it might not be sufficient. So, but that explains the thing that is not necessarily, on one hand, the first figure were about statutory minimum wages, the others about collective bargaining. And in Poland, you also have, pretty much like in the US, if you have bargaining at all, you have it only at the company level. There is no sectoral approach.
Thank you.
Finland?
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to how the directive is being implemented in, I'm imagining like Eastern European countries that have in part designed their economies around attracting foreign investment from very low tax rates, very low wages, and a mobile labor force.
Right. Yeah, interestingly, I mean, yeah, you're right. That sounds like, how does this fit together? Of course. Nevertheless, I mean, the foreign investment they attract are in industry which, among these countries, still have relatively high wages. I mean, they have low wages compared to the West, but they have, like, say, the automobile plants in Hungary have, in the Hungarian context, have very high wages. So, and these are not mainly the sectors which are covered by minimum wage. Minimum wages are even about, maybe about the service sector workers, which are even below, but of course also may have an impact on the overall wage cost of all these countries. But I mean, as far as I observe it, probably most in Eastern Europe, I mean, the strongest supporters of these directives came from Eastern Europe, I have to say. So all the unions, of course, they were saying, because they're struggling for now 30 years since the fall of the Iron Curtain, and more than 30 years already. And they try all kind of ways to develop their system, and they only see that the erosion goes further. Unions become weaker, bargaining becomes even weaker, and so they have a great hope in that directive that it might have a change and that it helps them really to re-strengthen the systems. And they were successful, but only in terms of regarding statutory minimum wages. So you saw a lot of quite significant increases of statutory minimum wages in Eastern Europe. So far, they were not so successful in strengthening collective bargaining systems. That's new. So that's the issue. But I would say in that countries, I mean, actually Hungary abstained also by the vote for this, but all the other European countries were, or also Eastern European countries were supporting it. So, and I don't see that this is in the end a big issue for the question of foreign investment in the countries.
All right, time for one more, yeah.
There have been a few articles in like the American business press over the last year about really low growth in Germany, and it's partly because of China's not buying as many German cars.
Right.
I'm interested if you could talk maybe generally about how you see some like structural changes to the political economy posing challenges to this statutory framework.
Right. Okay, this would be an invitation for another call, talk about the changes of the German capitalism and the German model, of course. Yeah, that's a dramatic change we're seeing now, and also a lot of uncertainty how where it goes, because especially Germany still has, if you look compared to other Western countries, an extraordinary high proportion of manufacturing compared to almost all the other countries, and that has of course mainly to do with this core cluster of the automobile industry, chemical industry, machine building, the industry main thing. And that's of course also the best regulated, with the strongest unions in Germany. So in that sense, if this industry and this cluster won't work anymore, this would have a significant impact, of course, pretty high also on trade unions and also the overall institution. And of course, the business community also now partly try to blame the workers and the system about we have too high wage costs and so on, too high labor costs. I mean, I think that all the more proper analysis you see about the development in Germany is that the problem is not about the wages or wage costs, but there are significant problems, for instance, in management, not seeing the new trends coming up and relying very much on their old production model because they were able to make good profits. Therefore, the pressure was not that hard. Only more recently they see very clearly how they really drastically have to change, and now we have already the announcement of some mass redundancies in some of the, especially the car supplier industry. So there is a big struggle going on, and in the end, also I'm pretty sure that we will see a certain development and change of the German model, that it probably become more like other European models, not so much relying on manufacturing anymore, because we are really in a big crisis here, and the trend, there are other players who are not really on the front. We have to see that, it's very clear. And that also had an impact, especially for the manufacturing unions, that they're becoming much weaker, and we have to think on the final, maybe one final thought. I mean, we were, on the other hand, the more progressive wing, I would say, of the German labor movement, they always had a very critical view on this highly export-led growth model, which was based on German capitalism, because this huge export surplus also meant to a certain extent that we export our problems, unemployment and so on, to other countries. So we solve our problems through the export of other countries. And that this system has to become more balanced. This was always a core point of critical view on the German system, and probably we are now in a transformation where we, in the end, have to become more balanced system.
Please join me in thanking